Opening the door for queenside development, this knight hop strategically prepares to influence the center while maintaining flexibility. Commanding the center immediately, black establishes a robust pawn presence and opens diagonals for development. Fortifying the center pawn and preparing for development, this move offers a solid, albeit passive, start, potentially inviting black to seize more space. Developing this knight directly contests central influence and prepares for castling. Challenging black's central grip with a pawn storm, white boldly contests the d5 square and seeks rapid development. Black solidifies the center, preparing to develop the bishop and creating a solid pawn structure. Bolstering the queenside, this quiet maneuver prepares for a solid development and a potential queenside pawn advance, subtly restricting black's maneuvering room. Solidifying central influence and preparing to contest the d4 square, this pawn push creates a flexible pawn structure. Developing the bishop here prepares to contest the central d5 pawn and aims for active piece play across the long diagonal. Solidifying central presence, this knight readies to contest dominion over d4 and e5, contributing to black's developing harmony. Opening this central file immediately introduces dynamic possibilities, potentially leading to exchanges that simplify the position and might favor white's slightly more developed pieces. Opening the d-file now demands vigilance from black. Maintaining central influence with the pawn on d5 is paramount, lest white's bishops gain an unstoppable diagonal sweep towards your monarch. Unpinning the knight and establishing a classic pin on the black queen opens lines for white's pieces and forces black to consider awkward defensive maneuvers, potentially leading to structural weaknesses. Developing the bishop to d6 immediately challenges white's influence on the central squares and prepares for castling, aiming to solidify black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay if white overextends. Castling tucks the king away safely on the flank, preparing to connect the rooks and activate them on the open files that have emerged. Securing the king immediately addresses the paramount need for safety in this developing position, mirroring white's earlier prudent decision and allowing for future piece activity. Opening the central d-file, white challenges black's pawn chain and aims to create dynamic possibilities, potentially forcing a commitment from the opponent and gaining a tempo advantage if the central tension is resolved quickly. Conceding the central pawn opens up the d-file for white's rook, but crucially, it frees black's bishop on d6, allowing it to directly eye white's castled king. This exchange also simplifies the position, potentially heading towards a more open game where piece activity will be paramount, and black has no immediate weaknesses to exploit. Recapturing on d4 opens up the d-file, creating potential lines of attack for both sides, and solidifies white's central presence after the pawn exchange. Seeking shelter from the immediate bishop threat, the knight now finds a safer outpost, solidifying the pawn structure. This retreat, while seemingly passive, allows black to regroup, eyeing the d4 knight and preparing for future central skirmishes. It cleverly avoids immediate confrontation, prioritizing development and piece harmony. Sharpening the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, this maneuver repositions the piece to a more active square, directly eyeing the pawn on d5 and potentially supporting a future advance of the central pawns. Initiating a bolder challenge to white's central control, this queen repositioning aims to pressure the d4 knight and prepare for potential counterplay down the d-file once white's structure inevitably shifts. Sculpting a kingside defensive structure often involves a dedicated pawn push, aiming to support the monarchy and potentially launch an attack later. Bolstering the central pawns and securing the king are paramount now. bb6 strategically redirects the bishop from its current outpost to a more active diagonal, ready to exert pressure on white's queenside and potentially prepare for a pawn advance on the queenside or even a knight maneuver to the d4 square if circumstances allow. Seizing the initiative on the queenside, this bishop maneuver immediately challenges black's central influence and targets the sensitive d5 pawn, aiming to disrupt its support network and potentially gain control of crucial diagonals. The queen's repositioning to e5 offers a direct challenge to white's bishop on a3, aiming to force a decision and potentially simplify the position while also eyeing the weakened kingside. Finally, the bishop's long-range threat is resolved, simplifying the board and giving white a clear advantage in the ensuing phase. The black king, now exposed after its castle is demolished, immediately seeks sanctuary on the 8th rank, a wise choice to escape the imminent threats cascading from white's bishop. Stabilizing the knight on d2 opens up the c-file for potential pressure and prepares for a more solid central presence, while also ensuring the knight is out of the line of fire from black's queen and bishop. Initiating a strategic exchange on d4, black seizes the initiative to simplify the position and dismantle white's central influence, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for their own pieces. This calculated concession of material aims for a more dynamic and active middle game, potentially leading to an endgame advantage if white is unable to effectively defend against black's unleashed forces. Reclaiming the center is paramount after the exchange, and this recapture solidifies white's pawn structure, potentially opening the e-file for a rook later if needed. Seizing the d-pawn presents a tantalizing immediate material gain, but it leaves your monarch suspiciously exposed to a pincer from the white pieces, forcing a significant positional concession as you'll likely spend valuable tempi recovering. Shifting the knight to f3 reclaims kingside mobility, preparing to contest the d-file which is currently dominated by black's queen and aims to create outposts for pieces in the ensuing middle game, potentially on e5 or even d5 if circumstances allow. Dismantling the queenless landscape now seems paramount, forcing a strategic recalibration as the king's central presence becomes a potential liability. Clearing the last major piece from the board now simplifies white's path towards exploiting the isolated d-pawn and potentially creating a queenside advantage with the queenside pawns. The knight's repositioning to e4 is a bold attempt to seize initiative in the center, eyeing the weakened kingside and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the piece with the rook instantly activates it, opening lines and preparing to challenge the exposed black king. A daring knight sortie, venturing deep into enemy territory where its protection is tenuous, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and possibly exploit the weakened squares around the monarch. A bold, aggressive push to exploit black's exposed monarch, aiming to disrupt the delicate equilibrium and generate immediate threats against the king's sanctuary. Reinforcing the pawn chain while simultaneously opening a critical diagonal for the king's escape route significantly improves black's defensive posture. Piloting the king to safety amidst the lingering chaos, this maneuver shields your monarch from potential diagonal threats while preparing to activate the knight on f3 and potentially contest the open d-file. Exploring the uncharted territory of the kingside, black's knight suddenly materializes, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed fortress and potentially exploit the exposed g2 square. This audacious maneuver forces white to address the immediate threat, potentially diverting resources from central control or development. Creating a defensive barrier to protect the recently exposed king, this pawn advance aims to drive back the intrusive knight and potentially open a line for the rook later on. A bold knight sacrifice, steering the game towards a complex tactical skirmish where forcing checks become the primary weapon for disruption. The king bravely steps into the fray, seeking refuge from the immediate cavalry charge and setting up a potential counterattack along the opened file. Unleashing the knight from its knightly confinement, black repositions its steed to a more active square, eyes now set on infiltrating white's weakened kingside. This repositioning aims to create tactical threats and potentially disrupt white's already precarious defensive structure, leveraging the exposed nature of the king after the earlier exchanges. Restoring peace balance and preparing for the endgame is the primary goal here, aiming to resolve the awkward bishop on d3 and establish a more harmonious setup. Asserting space on the kingside with this pawn push immediately cramps white's knight on f3 and aims to disrupt any immediate plans of peace activity there, while simultaneously preparing to develop the king's rook to a more active central file. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain opens up the dark squares for white's pieces, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king and create new attacking avenues, even if it momentarily reduces material advantage. Sacrificing the pawn opens up a critical diagonal, directly threatening white's exposed king and disrupting their defensive setup by forcing the bishop to capture. Reclaiming the central squares and establishing a strong pawn presence, this maneuver offers a chance to consolidate after black's adventurous knight sortie. The rook finally finds a home on the open b-file, an aggressive leap that immediately challenges the pawn structure and pressures white's queenside pawns, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses as white scrambles to defend. Unleashing a knight's pawn guarding potential, this maneuver aims to reclaim the initiative by leveraging the doubled g-pawns as a defensive shield, while preparing to support a potential queenside expansion or a more active king hunt. Solidifying the bishop's position and bringing it to a more active diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's attacking intentions on the kingside and potentially open up lines for counterplay. Clearing the c-file offers an immediate avenue for the rook to participate actively, aiming to exploit the relatively exposed black king and the pawn structure's potential weaknesses. Relocating the monarch is a sensible decision, as the king now finds a much safer haven, shielded from the open files and potential checks, while simultaneously preparing to support the rook's eventual activity. Bringing the rook to the second rank initiates a potential pressure campaign, aiming to control the open c-file and support any pawn advancements that might arise on the queen side. Reclaiming the open file provides crucial breathing room and prepares a more active defense. Repositioning the rook to the seventh rank aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around their king. Instead of passively defending, consider how this rook maneuver opens up possibilities for further penetration, perhaps targeting the vulnerable g6 pawn or creating mating nets if black's king becomes too exposed. This action might be preparing to contest the open c-file or initiate a siege on the queen side. The choice to place the rook here, rather than on the more common c-file, suggests a deeper plan to exploit the diagonal light squares or to surprise black with a less obvious attack. Think about the long-term implications of this rook's placement on black's defensive setup and how it forces them to constantly be aware of threats along that rank. Unlocking the c-file for potential infiltration with the rook offers a dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and establish active piece play. Unleashing the bishop to attack the unsuspecting pawn, white seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn down the b-file, aiming to exploit any weaknesses in the endgame that might arise from this aggressive pawn grab. The bishop finds a more active square, eyeing potential pressure on the king side while also supporting the knight's advanced position. Reclaiming the diagonal with the bishop now allows for a more flexible defense and potential counterplay against black's activated pieces. Consolidating the monarch's safety becomes paramount. Repositioning the king to the relative security of the f6 square prepares for a potential retreat to the g7 square, offering a crucial escape route should the rook or bishop on the c-file create further pressure. Resigning to the inevitable exchange of pieces leads to a position where white's king becomes unexpectedly exposed. Reclaiming the central squares with the king initiates a bold maneuver to activate your monarch in this unusual pawn-down endgame, aiming to exploit the opponent's somewhat misplaced pieces. Reactivating the central rook to a more active file, aiming to dislodge black's entrenched bishop and gain a foothold on the third rank. A timely repositioning, this bishop abandons its defensive post, seeking to exploit the now open diagonal and potentially disrupt white's coordination on the queen side. A calculated repositioning, Ray 2 aims to re-establish a more active role for the rook, perhaps preparing to support a central pawn push or even to swing over to the kingside should black commit to a pawn advance there, while simultaneously freeing up the bishop on f3 for potential defensive duties or even a surprising regrouping. Relocating the bishop to the edge of the board activates a previously passive piece, preparing for a potential breakthrough on the queen side or to support advances on the king side. aiming to exploit the open files now that white's rooks are no longer defending the d-file. Reshuffling the rook back to its starting square might seem passive, but it's a crucial regrouping, allowing white to reevaluate the static defense of the king against black's mobile bishop and prepare for a potential kingside pawn advance should the opportunity arise. Repositioning the bishop to the c7 square, black seeks to consolidate their queenside presence, potentially eyeing the open c-file for future influence. A puzzling repetition signals a potential stagnation in white's plans, allowing black ample time to solidify their position and perhaps find a more dynamic approach to the now very passive board. Returning the bishop to its previous square suggests a reevaluation of the king's safety, as the persistent shuttle of pieces hints at an underlying instability in black's position. The knight on d6 is now an inviting target for further centralization by white's pieces. Repeating the rook's journey is sacrificing tempo in a position where even minor advantages matter. Consider repositioning the bishop for a more active role. The black bishop vacates its post, a subtle but significant shift as the rooks eye each other across the board, potentially creating new avenues for attack or defense depending on subsequent exchanges. A remarkable repetition of moves suggests a player searching for an acceptable path forward, perhaps hoping for a tactical slip from the opponent in a rather static position. The rook's repositioning to the edge of the board, while seemingly passive, prepares for potential future pawn advances on the queenside, seeking to create new avenues for attack or defense as the game inches towards its endgame stages. The repetition of this rook shuffle on e1 signifies a lack of clear positional direction, allowing black to solidify their piece placement and prepare for future offensive actions. A subtle positional readjustment. The bishop seeks a less exposed post, aiming to eventually rejoin the fight on the queenside and potentially contest the open c-file, but it momentarily concedes central influence. The king feels remarkably safe behind that pawn shield, allowing a patient regrouping of forces to bolster the central control and prepare for future advances. Repetitive bishop maneuvers like this, instead of engaging the kingside or contesting the now open c-file, signal a lack of aggressive intent and a potential surrender of the initiative. The repetition of Re1 suggests a player struggling to find a constructive plan, perhaps hoping for their opponent to falter or to simply stall for time, a strategy that rarely yields decisive advantages in the long run and can allow the initiative to slip away. Probing for weaknesses on the queenside, this pawn push aims to create dynamic play and potentially open lines for black's rooks and bishop. The knight's journey to the queenside establishes a tenacious outguard, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and prepare a potential infiltration. The bishop's persistent hopscotch across the board, returning to c8, signals a potential lull, but it might be a clever setup for a surprise maneuver. Observe how the rook's presence on the 7th rank offers a subtle threat, and if the opponent overextends, that bishop could find itself in a much less comfortable position. Initiating the rook's repositioning to the d-file, a strategic shift aiming to challenge black's pawn structure and potentially support a pawn push later. Pushing this pawn forward attempts to unlock counterplay on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and create potential weaknesses in their pawn structure, although it also creates a potential target for white's rook. Unlocking the kingside is the ultimate goal here, as the opponent's pawn structure is begging to be exploited. The pawn's thrust forward, 45 f4, ignites latent attacking potential down the kingside, transforming the static pawn chain into an active spearhead aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup and create dynamic imbalances. Sacrificing the rook to disrupt black's past pawn advance offers a glimmer of counterplay amidst a deteriorating position. The pawn advances, hoping to open lines and disrupt the otherwise passive rook's grip on the 7th rank, yet it might overextend and create a critical weakness for the black king. The bishop now establishes a commanding presence on the diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing for a possible advance of the g-pawn to further restrict black's pieces. Repositioning the bishop to the queenside looks like an attempt to both defend the vulnerable pawn on a5 and potentially support a kingside advance down the road. But it does leave the b7 pawn somewhat exposed to further pressure from the white rook. Targeting the pawn on g3 with the knight immediately forces black to commit their king to a defensive posture, potentially freeing up white's pieces. Unleashing the king on this open board is a daring gamble, seeking to exploit the weakened pawn structure and open diagonals for counterplay. This knight's daring excursion to the center suddenly presents a dual threat, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure while simultaneously eyeing potential breakthroughs around the exposed king. Unleashing the bishop to occupy the active diagonal, challenging white's advanced pawn and creating a central outpost for black's pieces. Opening up the knight's central influence, this repositioning aims to challenge black's solidified pawn structure and potentially disrupt the well-placed bishop. The rook's return to the first rank suggests a reassessment of the queenside pressure, aiming to coordinate with the bishop for a potential attack on the vulnerable white king, while also keeping an eye on the pawn structure. Reigniting the initiative, white's knight repositions to a more central and active square, preparing to either contest control of the d-file or support a potential pawn push, aiming to exploit black's somewhat passively placed pieces and limited kingside space. Dislodging the rook from its active central position allows white to regain significant control over the d-file and potentially reroute their knight to more menacing squares.